I'm Janet Morrison, 32 years old, and I built my career in law enforcement from the ground up. For years, I stood by my mom, supporting her through divorce, long shifts at the hospital, and even her decision to remarry a man the whole church admired. But the night I caught my stepfather slap her in the kitchen, then order her to smile in church, or else, I knew silence wasn't an option anymore. Have you ever given everything to someone only to be betrayed in the cruelest way? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself or for someone you love, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. My mother taught me that silence was a virtue. Growing up, she was the steady one, the parent who never raised her voice even when my biological father walked out on us when I was 12. She worked double shifts at the hospital, came home exhausted, and still managed to pack my lunches and help with homework. I never heard her complain, not once. When other kids talked about their parents fighting, I felt grateful. Mom didn't fight with anyone. She just kept moving forward, quiet and determined. The house felt too big after Dad left. Mom would sit at the kitchen table after I went to bed, paying bills under the yellow light. Sometimes I'd sneak downstairs for water and see her shoulders shaking, but she never made a sound. Even her grief was silent. I learned to be quiet too, to not add to her burden. We became a team of two, moving through life with careful steps and whispered conversations. When I graduated high school, Mom started dating again. She deserved happiness, I told myself. She'd given everything to raise me alone, and now it was her turn. Richard came into our lives gradually, attending church events where they met, bringing flowers on Sundays, offering to fix things around the house. He was older, established, respected in the congregation. People called him a good man, a man of faith. Mom smiled more when he was around, and I convinced myself that was enough. Their courtship lasted 2 years. Richard never pushed, never demanded. He waited patiently while Mom made her decisions, supported her when she worried about changing our family dynamic, assured both of us that he understood his role. When they married, I was 22 and starting my career in law enforcement. I walked her down the aisle, proud to see her in white again, hopeful that she'd found the partner she deserved. The wedding reception was held in the church fellowship hall. Richard's friends from the congregation spoke about his character, his dedication to service, his patience with my mother during their courtship. My mom's coworkers from the hospital talked about how she'd glowed those past months, how love had brought color back to her cheeks. I gave a toast, thanking Richard for making my mother happy, for treating her with the respect she'd always deserved. He shook my hand firmly afterward, promised to take care of her. I believed him. The early months seemed perfect. Richard moved into our house, the one Mom had worked so hard to keep after the divorce. He updated the kitchen, installed new fixtures, painted the walls colors Mom had always wanted but never could afford. They attended church together every Sunday, sat in the third pew from the front, participated in Bible study on Wednesday nights. Mom seemed settled in a way she hadn't been since I was small. I visited regularly those first months, joining them for Sunday dinners, helping Richard with yard work, watching them navigate the rhythms of married life. Mom deferred to him on small decisions, which restaurant to choose, what movie to watch, when to schedule repairs. I told myself this was normal, that she was simply adjusting to partnership after years of making every choice alone. Richard seemed attentive, protective even. When other men at church spoke to Mom, he'd appear at her side, hand on her shoulder, smiling but watchful. My police training had taught me to observe behavior, to notice patterns, but I wasn't looking for problems at home. Richard provided stability Mom had never had. He handled the finances, managed the household maintenance, took charge of social calendar planning. Mom seemed grateful to let someone else make decisions for a while. When I asked how married life was treating her, she'd smile and say Richard took good care of her. Her words carried gratitude, relief even. The church embraced them as a couple. Richard had been a bachelor for years, involved in men's ministry, respected for his steadiness and wisdom. Now he had a wife who complemented his image perfectly: gentle, supportive, devoted. They were invited to lead marriage enrichment classes, to mentor younger couples, to represent the congregation at community events. People pointed to them as an example of God's blessing, proof that patience and faith led to lasting love. But as months passed, I noticed subtle changes. Mom's spontaneous laughter became rarer. She checked with Richard before answering simple questions, even when he wasn't present. When I called, she'd glance toward wherever he was in the house before settling into conversation. These weren't dramatic shifts, just small calibrations in her behavior that reminded me of those careful months after Dad left, when she was learning to be alone. Richard's confidence grew alongside his reputation. At church functions, he'd speak for both of them, making plans and commitments without consulting Mom first. She'd nod agreement, smile appropriately, but I noticed she'd stopped offering her own opinions. When church members asked her thoughts on various topics, she'd deflect to Richard's expertise, praising his wisdom and judgment. The woman who had raised me with quiet strength was disappearing behind someone else's shadow. I tried to rationalize what I saw. Marriage required compromise, adjustment, the blending of two independent lives into one shared existence. Mom had been alone for over a decade. Naturally, she'd need time to remember how to be part of a couple. Richard had waited patiently for love. Now he was simply taking his role as husband seriously, providing leadership and protection the way he'd been taught men should. Their first-year anniversary passed with a celebration at church. Richard stood before the congregation, thanking God for blessing him with such a devoted wife, praising Mom's gentle spirit and supportive nature. She sat in the front row, hands folded, smiling appropriately while he spoke about their happiness. Everyone applauded, but I found myself watching her face instead of his. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she held herself with the careful stillness of someone afraid to move wrong. That night, driving home from the anniversary celebration, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in our family dynamic. Mom had always been quiet, but this was different. This wasn't the peaceful silence of contentment, it was the wary quiet of someone who had learned that speaking carried risks. I told myself I was overthinking, projecting my professional suspicions onto a situation that didn't warrant investigation. Richard loved Mom, and she was finally experiencing the security she deserved. My mother taught me that silence was a virtue, but she never taught me to recognize when silence became a prison. The changes accelerated after their first anniversary. Mom's conversations became more guarded, her movements more calculated. When I visited, she'd serve Richard first, clear his plate before touching her own food, defer to his preferences on everything from television programs to dinner conversation topics. These weren't acts of affection, they felt like performances, carefully choreographed to avoid disruption. Richard's expectations became more pronounced. He'd correct Mom's posture during church services, remind her to smile when greeting other congregants, guide her elbow when walking as if she couldn't navigate independently. Other church members commented positively on his attentiveness, his protective nature, his dedication to helping Mom become the woman God intended her to be. They saw leadership where I was beginning to see control. Sunday dinners at their house developed a ritual quality. Richard would say grace, speaking at length about gratitude and submission and the proper order of family relationships. Mom would serve the meal he'd planned, prepared according to his specifications, timed to his schedule. Conversation flowed through topics he selected, guided by observations he wanted to share. Mom contributed appropriately, supporting his points, asking questions that allowed him to demonstrate his knowledge and wisdom. I started paying attention to the silences between words, the pauses before Mom responded to questions, the way she checked his expression before laughing at jokes. These weren't the comfortable rhythms of an established marriage. They were the careful negotiations of someone walking through a minefield. Every response calculated, every reaction measured against an unspoken standard of acceptability. The church community saw their marriage as exemplary. Richard's reputation continued growing, and Mom's quiet support enhanced his image as a man who understood proper family roles. People sought his advice on marriage, parenting, spiritual leadership. He'd share wisdom about patience, understanding, the importance of wives supporting their husband's vision for the family. Mom would nod agreement from beside him, living proof of his teaching's effectiveness. But late at night, when I reviewed those Sunday dinners and church interactions, patterns emerged that disturbed my professional instincts. The way Mom's shoulders tensed when Richard's voice rose. How she'd glance at him before answering direct questions. The careful neutrality of her expressions when he dominated conversations. The absence of the spontaneous joy she'd shown during their courtship. I began finding excuses to visit more frequently, arriving unannounced to help with yard work or household projects. Richard always welcomed me warmly, but I noticed how Mom's behavior shifted depending on whether we were alone or he was present. With him nearby, she was measured, appropriate, supportive. During brief moments when he stepped away, flashes of her old self would emerge, quick jokes, honest opinions, genuine laughter, before disappearing again when he returned. The transformation was so gradual that questioning it felt like betraying both of them. Richard provided everything Mom had lacked during her single years: financial security, social standing, partnership in managing life's responsibilities. She no longer worked double shifts or worried about making ends meet. Her position as his wife elevated her status in the church community, gave her purpose and identity beyond the survival mode that had defined her single motherhood. But as I watched them together, I couldn't escape the growing conviction that something essential about my mother was being systematically erased. The woman who had raised me with quiet strength, who had made countless independent decisions and survived years of challenges alone, was disappearing into someone else's shadow. Her silence was no longer the peaceful quiet of contentment. It was the wary stillness of someone who had learned that speaking carried consequences. My mother taught me that silence was a virtue, but I was beginning to understand that some silences protect the wrong people. The first time I witnessed Richard's true nature, I almost convinced myself I'd misunderstood what happened. It was a Wednesday evening in October, 3 months after their anniversary. I'd stopped by to return some tools Richard had lent me, arriving later than usual because of a work emergency. The house was quiet except for voices coming from the kitchen. I knocked, but no one answered. The back door was unlocked, so I stepped inside, calling out to announce my presence. The voices stopped abruptly. I found them standing near the sink, Mom washing dishes while Richard stood behind her, closer than felt natural. Both seemed startled by my appearance, and the atmosphere carried the sharp tension that follows interrupted conflict. "Just returning your socket set," I said, holding up the tool bag. "Sorry I'm so late." Richard recovered first, his smile appearing with practiced ease. "No problem at all. Janet was just cleaning up from Bible study preparation. Long day for both of us." Mom turned from the sink, and I noticed the careful way she moved, avoiding sudden gestures. Her smile seemed forced, and she kept glancing at Richard as if gauging his mood. "How was work, honey? You look tired." We made small talk for 10 minutes, but the undercurrent of tension never dissipated. Richard dominated the conversation, asking questions about my cases, sharing observations about law enforcement, positioning himself as the expert on topics outside his experience. Mom contributed appropriately but sparingly, drying dishes with mechanical precision while we talked. When I left that evening, something felt unresolved, incomplete. The interaction had the quality of a performance interrupted before its conclusion, leaving all the actors uncertain about their next lines. I drove home replaying the scene, trying to identify what had felt wrong beyond the obvious awkwardness of arriving unexpectedly. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to their dynamic during family gatherings. Richard's behavior in public remained exemplary, attentive, protective, appropriately affectionate. But I started noticing moments when his mask seemed to slip, brief flashes of irritation when Mom spoke without prompting, subtle corrections disguised as helpful guidance, the way his hand would tighten on her shoulder when she said something he hadn't approved. The church community continued praising their marriage, but I began hearing different undertones in their interactions. Richard's public compliments about Mom's submissive spirit felt less like appreciation and more like warnings. His jokes about training her properly carried sharp edges beneath the humor. His teachings about wives supporting their husbands' leadership sounded increasingly like instructions rather than observations. Mom's responses to these public moments became more telling than the moments themselves. She'd smile on cue, nod agreement at appropriate times, demonstrate the exact behavior he was praising or describing. But her compliance felt performative, calculated to meet expectations rather than expressing genuine sentiment. The spontaneous woman who had raised me was being replaced by someone playing a carefully scripted role. Friends from church would comment on how well Mom had adapted to marriage, how beautifully she supported Richard's ministry, how blessed they both were to have found such compatible partnership. These observations felt like indictments rather than compliments. They were praising the disappearance of everything that had made my mother herself, celebrating her transformation into someone else's reflection. I started calling more frequently, timing conversations for when Richard would be at work or church meetings. During these brief windows, Mom's voice would relax slightly and traces of her old personality would emerge. She'd share small frustrations about household management, laugh at silly jokes, ask questions about my work with genuine curiosity. But the moment she heard Richard's car in the driveway, the conversation would shift, becoming more formal and guarded. The contrast between these two versions of my mother troubled my sleep. In Richard's presence, she was carefully controlled, every word and gesture measured against some internal standard of acceptability. Alone, she was still recognizably herself, but increasingly fragile, as if the person I'd known was fading from lack of use. I began to understand that I was witnessing something more complex than adjustment to marriage. I was watching the systematic erasure of someone's identity. But recognizing the problem and knowing how to address it were entirely different challenges. Richard had never overtly harmed Mom, never raised his voice in my presence, never done anything that would justify intervention. He provided well for her, included her in social activities, treated her with public respect. Any concerns I raised would sound like jealousy or misunderstanding of normal marital dynamics. The church community's approval of their relationship made questioning it even more difficult. These were people who had known both Richard and Mom for years, who saw them together regularly, who had experience recognizing healthy and unhealthy relationships. If something was truly wrong, surely others would notice. My isolation in seeing problems suggested the problems might exist primarily in my imagination. But late at night, reviewing conversations and interactions, I couldn't escape the conviction that my mother was disappearing. The woman who had survived my father's abandonment, who had worked multiple jobs to keep our family together, who had faced every challenge with quiet determination, was being methodically erased. Her silence was no longer protective, it was prison. That night in October was a beginning, not an ending. I was starting to see what I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, that sometimes the people we trust to protect those we love are the ones we most need to protect them from. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening in February. I'd spent the afternoon at their house, helping Richard install new shelving in the garage while Mom prepared dinner. The project had taken longer than expected, and we'd worked through the usual dinner time. Mom had kept the meal warm, adjusting timing without complaint, but I could see the stress of managing an unpredictable schedule wearing on her. We finally sat down to eat at nearly 8 o'clock. Mom had prepared Richard's favorite meal, roast chicken with vegetables, but the extended warming had dried out the meat and overcooked the carrots. Richard said nothing during the first few bites, but his expression grew increasingly disapproving. Mom ate nervously, apologizing for the timing, explaining about the delayed schedule, trying to manage his obvious dissatisfaction. "It's fine, Janet," Richard said, his voice carrying the forced patience of someone being generous about obvious failure. "Not everyone can manage time effectively." "I understand." Mom's face flushed, and she set down her fork. I kept checking the oven. "I tried to keep everything at the right temperature." "Of course you did. I'm not criticizing your effort." But his tone suggested exactly the opposite, and Mom's shoulders sagged slightly. I found myself speaking before I'd thought through the wisdom of intervention. "Dinner's great, Mom. You did the best you could with a changing schedule." Richard's attention shifted to me, his smile sharp around the edges. "Janet appreciates your support, but she understands the importance of learning from mistakes. That's how marriages grow stronger. The conversation continued, but something had shifted. Richard's comments became more pointed, Mom's responses more defensive, and I found myself caught between wanting to protect her and not wanting to escalate the tension. By the time I left that evening, all three of us were exhausted from navigating the unspoken conflict that had dominated the meal. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Mom on a Tuesday afternoon. She rarely called during work hours, and her voice sounded strained when I answered. "Could you stop by tonight? There's something I need to discuss with you. Is everything okay? We'll talk when you get here." Richard's car wasn't in the driveway when I arrived. Mom let me in through the back door, moving carefully as if her body hurt. She'd prepared coffee, but her hands shook slightly as she poured it. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared so many conversations during my growing up years, but this felt different. Dangerous somehow. "Richard's at a church meeting," she said without preamble. "He won't be back for 2 hours." I waited, sensing she needed to find her own words. "I need you to know that I'm handling things at home. The marriage has some challenges, but that's normal. All couples go through adjustment periods." "Mom, what's going on?" She looked out the window, avoiding my eyes. "Richard has strong opinions about how families should function. Sometimes we disagree about methods, but we share the same goals. I want you to understand that." Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech. But her body language contradicted everything she was saying. She sat rigidly, hands clenched in her lap, voice carefully controlled. "Has he hurt you?" "Richard would never hurt me. He's a good man who takes his responsibilities seriously. Maybe more seriously than I'm used to, but that's not necessarily bad." She wasn't answering my question directly, which was answer enough. But she was also warning me not to push further, signaling that intervention wasn't welcome. I found myself in the impossible position of watching someone I loved disappear while being told my help wasn't wanted. We talked for another 30 minutes, circling around the truth without ever landing on it directly. Mom insisted everything was fine while demonstrating through every word and gesture that nothing was fine. When Richard's headlights appeared in the driveway, she immediately stood up, smoothing her hair, checking her reflection in the window glass. "Please don't worry about me," she said as I prepared to leave. "I know how to take care of myself." But watching her transform from the vulnerable woman who'd called me for help into the careful, controlled wife greeting her husband, I knew she was lying. The woman who had taught me that silence was a virtue was drowning in silence, and I was the only one who could see her going under. That night, I realized I had reached the limit of passive observation. Something would have to change, or I was going to lose my mother entirely. The question was whether I had the courage to act on what I knew, and whether she would ever forgive me if I did. The decision came sooner than I expected. 3 days after Mom's careful warning about not worrying, I found myself back at their house on Friday evening. Richard had asked for help moving furniture in preparation for hosting a church social, and I'd agreed to assist after work. I arrived early, hoping for a few minutes alone with Mom to gauge how she was managing the stress of entertaining. I knocked on the front door, then used my key when no one answered. The house was quiet, but I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. I called out my arrival as I walked through the living room, but the voices stopped abruptly. When I reached the kitchen doorway, the scene before me shattered every rationalization I'd constructed about their marriage. Richard had Mom backed against the counter, his hand raised, his face twisted with rage. Mom cowered beneath him, one arm protecting her face, the other gripping the counter for support. The entire tableau lasted perhaps 2 seconds before they noticed my presence, but those 2 seconds revealed everything I'd been afraid to acknowledge. "What the hell is going on here?" Richard dropped his hand immediately, stepping back with practiced ease, his expression shifting to surprise and mild embarrassment. "We were just having a discussion about the social tonight. Janet's nervous about hosting, and I was trying to help her understand that everything will be fine." Mom straightened slowly, smoothing her blouse, avoiding my eyes. I was being silly about the preparations. Richard was just reassuring me. But her voice shook, and I could see the red mark on her cheek where his hand had connected. The careful control she'd maintained during our conversation earlier in the week had cracked, revealing the fear underneath. "Mom, did he hit you?" "Of course not," Richard answered before she could respond. "You misunderstood what you saw. Janet, tell him what really happened." Mom looked between us, trapped between the truth and the consequences of revealing it. "I'm fine. Richard would never hurt me. You startled us, that's all." I stared at the woman who had raised me, who had taught me the difference between right and wrong, who was now lying to protect the man who had just struck her. The betrayal felt like physical pain, not because she was lying to me, but because she felt she had to. Richard regained his composure completely, moving to put his arm around Mom's shoulders in a gesture that looked protective but felt possessive. "I think the stress of hosting tonight has everyone on edge. Why don't you go freshen up, Janet, while your son and I get the furniture moved?" Mom nodded gratefully, escaping upstairs while Richard and I faced each other across the kitchen. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. He was calculating his next move, and I was trying to process what I'd witnessed and what it meant for my mother's safety. "Look, I know how that appeared," Richard finally said, his voice reasonable and calm. "But you have to understand the situation from my perspective. Janet gets overwhelmed easily, and sometimes she needs firm guidance to help her manage anxiety. What you saw was me helping her regain control, not hurting her. You had your hand raised to strike her. I was gesturing. Maybe more emphatically than necessary, but I would never actually harm your mother. I love her." His explanation sounded plausible, delivered with the sincerity that had fooled the church community for nearly 2 years. But I had seen the fear in Mom's eyes, the practiced way she had protected herself, the familiarity with which she had responded to his threat. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. "She's terrified of you." Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. "Your mother is learning to trust my judgment instead of being paralyzed by her own insecurities. That process can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary for our marriage to succeed. I'm helping her become the woman God intended her to be." The religious justification for abuse made my stomach turn. I recognized the manipulation, the way he was reframing control as care, violence as guidance. Mom was trapped not just by fear, but by a belief system that told her submission was virtuous and resistance was sin. When Mom returned downstairs 20 minutes later, her makeup carefully repaired, we spent an awkward hour moving furniture while pretending the earlier confrontation hadn't happened. Richard maintained his helpful, charming demeanor, asking about my work, sharing church gossip, behaving like the respected community member he appeared to be. Mom contributed appropriately to the conversation, but I could see the effort it cost her to maintain the pretense. As I prepared to leave that evening, Mom walked me to the door while Richard finished arranging chairs in the living room. For a brief moment, we were alone. "Are you safe?" I whispered. She glanced toward the living room, then back at me. "I'm learning to be a better wife," she said quietly. "Richard has high standards, but he's helping me meet them. Mom, no one should have to live in fear. I'm not afraid. I'm grateful. Richard could have married anyone, but he chose me. The least I can do is try to deserve that gift." Her words broke my heart because I recognized the voice of someone who had been systematically convinced that abuse was love, that control was care, that her suffering was somehow earned. The woman who had raised me to be strong and independent had been taught that strength was selfishness and independence was sin. That night, I sat in my car outside their house until the lights went out, knowing I couldn't protect her if she wouldn't let me, but unable to drive away and leave her alone with him. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely powerless to help someone I loved. The next morning, I would have to decide whether to respect her choice to stay silent or break that silence for her. My mother had taught me that silence was a virtue, but sitting in that car, I finally understood that some virtues become weapons in the wrong hands. The church social the next evening played out exactly as I expected. Richard was the perfect host, charming and attentive, making sure every guest felt welcome while Mom served refreshments with practiced grace. People complimented them on their hospitality, their obvious love for each other, the way they worked together as a team. I watched from across the room as Mom smiled on cue, agreed with Richard's observations, demonstrated exactly the behavior he expected from a proper wife. But now I could see what I'd missed before. The careful way Mom positioned herself just out of his reach. How she checked his expression before speaking to guests. The subtle flinch when he touched her shoulder. The practiced quality of her responses, as if she'd rehearsed exactly what to say in every possible social situation. Other guests saw a devoted couple. I saw a woman performing for her safety. The breaking point came 2 days later on Sunday morning. Mom and Richard sat in their usual pew during service, participating appropriately in the liturgy, presenting their customary image of marital harmony. But I noticed things others missed. The way Mom held herself rigidly upright, the careful distance she maintained despite appearing close to Richard, the absence of genuine warmth in their interactions. After church, we gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and casual conversation. Richard was surrounded by his usual circle of admirers, sharing wisdom about marriage and family, accepting compliments on Mom's transformation since their wedding. She stood beside him, nodding agreement, playing her assigned role perfectly. But something was different that morning. Mom seemed more fragile than usual, her smile more forced, her responses more automatic. When someone asked about her opinion on the sermon, she glanced at Richard before answering, and I saw him give an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She immediately changed course, deflecting to praise his insights instead. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it revealed the complete control he exercised over even her most trivial communications. Mom couldn't express an opinion about a church sermon without his permission. She had been reduced to an extension of his will, a carefully programmed reflection of his preferences. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue watching my mother disappear while pretending everything was normal. If she wouldn't protect herself, I would have to do it for her. But I needed evidence, documentation, something more substantial than my observations and suspicions. Over the next week, I began building a case the way I'd been trained to investigate crimes. I documented patterns of behavior, recorded dates and times of concerning interactions, gathered information about Richard's background that might reveal previous incidents. The process felt like betraying my family, but it also felt like the first positive action I'd taken in months. I discovered that Richard's first marriage had ended in divorce 15 years earlier, a detail he'd minimized when courting Mom. Court records revealed his ex-wife had filed multiple domestic disturbance reports, though charges had never been pressed. The pattern was familiar: a man who presented well publicly while exercising control privately, whose victims were isolated and convinced their suffering was somehow deserved. I also learned that several women in the church had privately expressed concern about Richard's teachings on marriage, his emphasis on wives' submission, his tendency to become aggressive when challenged. But these concerns had never been formally raised because Richard's reputation protected him from serious scrutiny. The more I investigated, the clearer it became that Mom wasn't his first victim, just his most successful project. He had refined his techniques over years of practice, learning to select vulnerable women, isolate them from support systems, and convince them that abuse was love. The church community provided perfect cover, offering religious justification for control and social pressure to maintain appearances. But having evidence and knowing how to use it were different challenges. Intervening would expose Mom to retaliation, potentially making her situation worse. It would also cost me my relationship with her, since she had clearly chosen to protect Richard rather than herself. I faced an impossible choice: respect her autonomy to make destructive decisions, or override that autonomy to protect her safety. The decision was made for me on Thursday evening, for weeks after I'd witnessed Richard strike her. I received a call from Mom's neighbor, an elderly woman who had watched me grow up and still felt responsible for our family's welfare. She was concerned because she'd heard shouting coming from the house earlier in the evening, followed by a crash and then complete silence. I didn't want to call the police, she said. But something didn't sound right. Could you check on them? I arrived to find the house dark except for a light in the kitchen. Richard's car was gone, but Mom's was in the garage. I knocked, but no one answered. When I tried my key, the door was locked from inside, something that had never happened before. I walked around to the backyard and saw Mom sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She let me in reluctantly, claiming she had a headache and was resting before Richard returned from a meeting. But I could see the overturned chair, the broken glass swept into a pile, the careful way she moved as if her body hurt. When she turned toward the light, I saw the bruise on her temple, partially concealed by makeup but still visible. What happened here? I dropped a glass while cleaning. Clumsy of me. Richard helped me clean up before he left for his meeting. Her explanation was smooth, practiced, but it didn't account for the shouting the neighbor had heard or the fear I could see in her eyes. I realized that this had become routine, Richard's violence followed by Mom's silence, his absence allowing time for damage control before his return. Mom, you can't keep living like this. Living like what? Richard takes good care of me. We had a small disagreement, but all couples have disagreements. I'm learning to handle them better. He's hitting you. Richard has never seriously hurt me. Sometimes he gets frustrated with my mistakes, but he's always sorry afterward. He's under a lot of pressure at church, and I need to be more supportive. She was defending him even while sporting evidence of his violence, rationalizing abuse as love, accepting responsibility for his actions. The manipulation was so complete that she couldn't recognize her own victimization. She had been taught that questioning his treatment meant questioning God's plan, that resistance was sin, that suffering was proof of devotion. I stayed until Richard returned, ostensibly to help with some household repairs, but actually to witness his behavior when he found me there unexpectedly. He was perfectly controlled, greeting me warmly, asking about the repairs Mom had mentioned, behaving like a man who had nothing to hide. But I noticed how Mom's entire demeanor changed when he walked in, the way she immediately began serving him, apologizing for my presence, ensuring his comfort before her own. When I finally left that night, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The violence was escalating, and Mom's ability to protect herself was diminishing. If I didn't act soon, I would lose her entirely, either to more serious physical harm or to the complete erasure of her personality. The next opportunity one had to expose Richard publicly. I would take it, regardless of the consequences for my relationship with Mom. That opportunity came sooner than I expected, and it would test everything I'd learned about courage, justice, and the cost of breaking silence. The annual church banquet was scheduled for Saturday evening, 4 days after I'd found Mom with the bruise on her temple. It was the congregation's most formal event, attended by members and their families, community leaders, and visitors from neighboring churches. Richard had been selected to deliver the invocation, an honor that reflected his standing in the community and his reputation for spiritual wisdom. Mom spent the week preparing for the event with the meticulous attention she now applied to every public appearance. She had her hair done professionally, purchased a new dress that Richard had approved, practiced conversation topics that would reflect positively on his ministry. The preparations felt like armor she was building around herself, protection against the scrutiny that would come with being in the spotlight as Richard's wife. I watched her transform herself throughout the week, becoming increasingly polished and controlled. By Saturday afternoon, she resembled a political candidate's spouse more than the woman who had raised me, perfectly groomed, carefully scripted, designed to enhance someone else's image. The spontaneous mother of my childhood had been completely erased, replaced by someone playing a role that required constant vigilance. The banquet was held in the church's main hall, decorated with white tablecloths and spring flowers, designed to celebrate another successful year of ministry and community service. I arrived early to help with setup, but mainly to observe the dynamics between Mom and Richard in this public setting. They worked together seamlessly, greeting guests with practiced warmth, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and appreciated. But I could see the strain beneath Mom's perfect performance. She held herself with rigid control, every gesture calculated, every smile timed precisely. When Richard spoke to other guests, she listened with exaggerated attention, nodding agreement with his observations, demonstrating the supportive behavior he expected. She was performing the role of devoted wife with Oscar-worthy precision, but the cost of that performance showed in the tension around her eyes. Richard was in his element, moving through the crowd with confident ease, accepting congratulations on the church's growth, sharing insights about ministry and family life. People sought his advice, praised his wisdom, thanked him for his service to the community. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a respected leader, devoted husband, pillar of the congregation. I found myself studying the other guests, wondering how many of them saw what I saw, whether anyone else noticed the careful choreography of Mom's behavior or the subtle control Richard exercised over her every interaction. But their responses suggested they saw only what Richard wanted them to see: a successful marriage, a devoted couple, proof that traditional values led to lasting happiness. During the meal, I sat at a table across the room, watching Mom navigate the social requirements of her position. She made appropriate conversation with the guests around her, asked interested questions about their lives, shared carefully neutral observations about church activities. But I noticed she ate very little, and her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her water glass. When the time came for Richard's invocation, the hall fell silent as he approached the podium. He stood with quiet confidence, surveying the gathered congregation, preparing to offer words that would set the spiritual tone for the evening. This was his moment of triumph, the culmination of 2 years of building reputation and respect within the community. "Let us bow our heads in prayer," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him such an effective leader. "Heavenly Father, we gather tonight in gratitude for your blessings on our church family, for the marriages you have strengthened, for the wisdom you have granted us in building relationships that honor your design for family life." I watched Mom during his prayer, seeing how she held herself perfectly still, eyes closed, hands folded, demonstrating the reverent attention expected of a spiritual leader's wife. Every line of her body spoke of careful control, of someone who had learned exactly how to appear in public to reflect positively on her husband's ministry. Richard continued praying, speaking about submission and leadership, about wives supporting their husband's vision, about the beauty of marriages where traditional roles were properly understood and implemented. His words carried double meaning for anyone who knew how to listen, celebrating the very dynamic that was destroying my mother while presenting it as godly wisdom. The congregation murmured agreement with his prayer, grateful for leadership that understood proper family values, that modeled the kind of marriage relationships they wanted to emulate. Richard was giving them exactly what they wanted to hear, validating their beliefs about gender roles and spiritual authority while demonstrating the results through his own seemingly successful marriage. But as I listened to him pray about gratitude and blessing, about the joy of marriage built on correct principles, about wives who understood their role in supporting their husband's calling, something inside me snapped. The hypocrisy was unbearable. This man who beat my mother standing before our community as an example of godly manhood, using our faith to justify his cruelty while everyone praised his wisdom. Richard concluded his prayer with particular emphasis on thankfulness for wives who understood the beauty of submission, for marriages that reflected God's design for family hierarchy, for the peace that came when everyone accepted their proper role. The congregation responded with enthusiastic amens, grateful for his spiritual insight, inspired by his example of faithful leadership. As people raised their heads and prepared to begin eating, I found myself standing. I hadn't planned to act in this moment, but watching Richard receive applause for prayer that celebrated everything I'd witnessed him do to my mother made continued silence impossible. Every eye in the room turned toward me, confused by the interruption to the evening's program. "I saw everything," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something approaching alarm. The congregation stirred uncertainly, unsure what was happening or how to respond. Mom's face went pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she realized what was about to unfold. "I saw you hit my mother in your kitchen 4 weeks ago," I continued, my police training helping me maintain calm authority despite the emotional chaos inside. "I saw the bruise you left on her temple. I've watched you systematically destroy her confidence, isolate her from friends, Convince her that your abuse is love." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, people turning to each other with confusion and disbelief. Richard stood frozen at the podium, his carefully constructed image cracking before everyone's eyes. Mom sat motionless, trapped between defending him and protecting herself, paralyzed by the public exposure of what she'd worked so hard to hide. "These are serious accusations," Richard finally managed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I don't know what you think you saw, but you're clearly misunderstanding normal marital dynamics. Janet, tell them what our marriage is really like." All attention turned to Mom, who looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. She opened her mouth to defend him, to play her assigned role one more time, but no words came. For the first time in 2 years, she couldn't find the strength to protect him from the consequences of his actions. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my badge, holding it where everyone could see. "I'm Officer Janet Morrison's son, and I'm speaking as a sworn law enforcement officer who has witnessed domestic violence in this man's home." The room went completely silent. The badge changed everything, transforming my accusations from family drama into official testimony. Richard's face went white as he realized the full scope of what was happening, that this wasn't just personal conflict, but potential legal consequences. "This is outrageous," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've never harmed Janet. This is some kind of misunderstanding blown out of proportion by family jealousy." "Show them your temple, Mom," I said quietly. "Show them the bruise you tried to cover with makeup." Mom's hand moved involuntarily toward her hairline, where the makeup couldn't quite conceal the fading evidence of his violence. The gesture was small, but everyone saw it, and the room's energy shifted from confusion to growing understanding. People began looking at Richard differently, seeing past the spiritual leader to the man who hurt women in private. Pastor Williams stood up from the head table, his face grave with the realization that his congregation was witnessing the exposure of something far darker than anyone had imagined. "Richard, I think you should step down from the podium. We need to discuss this situation privately." But Richard wasn't ready to surrender his position without a fight. "This is a family matter being handled inappropriately in public. Janet knows how much I love her, how committed I am to our marriage. Don't let family conflict destroy years of ministry and service." He was appealing to the congregation's loyalty, trying to frame this as persecution rather than accountability. Some people nodded uncertainly, uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation, unsure whether to believe accusations against someone they'd respected for years. "Love doesn't leave bruises," I said, letting my voice carry to every corner of the room. "Service doesn't require terrorizing your wife. Ministry doesn't justify abuse." Mom stood up slowly, her movement drawing every eye in the room. For a moment, I thought she was going to defend him again, to play her role and preserve the facade they'd constructed together. But instead, she looked directly at Richard for the first time all evening. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Her words carried more weight than any accusation I could have made. This was the woman who had defended him publicly for 2 years, who had rationalized his behavior and protected his reputation, finally unable to continue the performance. Her simple refusal to defend him spoke louder than any testimony about what their marriage had really been. Richard stared at her with something approaching panic, realizing that his most important ally had just abandoned him. Without Mom's cooperation, his denials were worthless. Without her willingness to lie for him, his reputation couldn't be salvaged. The banquet hall remained silent as the full implications of what they'd witnessed began to settle over the congregation. This wasn't just a family disagreement or misunderstanding. This was the exposure of systematic abuse by someone they'd trusted, respected, and followed. Everything they thought they knew about Richard and his marriage had been carefully constructed fiction. Pastor Williams approached the podium with quiet authority. "Richard, you need to leave. Now. We'll be in touch about your future with this congregation, but tonight is over for you." Richard looked around the room one more time, seeing his reputation crumbling, his position dissolving, his carefully built life falling apart. Then his eyes found mine, and I saw rage that made me grateful we were in a public place surrounded by witnesses. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but his threat sounded empty now that everyone could see him clearly. As he walked toward the exit, the congregation remained silent, watching the man who had just finished praying about godly marriage reveal himself as someone who beat his wife while teaching others about love. The contrast between his public prayers and private actions couldn't have been starker. Mom sat back down heavily, her hands shaking now that the performance was finally over. People began approaching our table tentatively, offering support, apologizing for not seeing what had been happening, expressing shock at what they'd just witnessed. But I could see the cost of this exposure in Mom's face. She was free from having to protect Richard, but she was also facing the complete destruction of the life she'd tried so hard to build. Everything would change now, and change had always terrified her more than staying in situations that hurt her. The banquet ended early that night, people leaving in small groups, talking quietly about what they'd witnessed, trying to process the revelation that their spiritual leader had been abusing his wife while teaching them about marriage. Some would support Mom completely, others would struggle to reconcile what they'd seen with what they'd believed about Richard. As we drove home separately that night, I wondered whether I'd saved my mother or simply forced her to face truths she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The silence I'd broken had protected Richard while imprisoning her. Now she was free, but freedom can be more terrifying than captivity when it's all you've ever known. The phone calls started before we made it home, the church community beginning to rally around Mom while trying to understand how they'd been so completely deceived. The next few weeks would test everyone's commitment to supporting abuse survivors versus maintaining comfortable beliefs about the people they'd trusted. But that night, driving through the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope that my mother might finally have the chance to remember who she was before Richard taught her to be afraid. The immediate aftermath was chaos. By Sunday morning, the entire congregation knew what had happened at the banquet. Some members called to offer support, others to express shock and disbelief. A few suggested that family conflicts should be handled privately, that public accusations damaged everyone involved. Mom spent the day fielding calls while I stayed nearby, watching her navigate the sudden attention with the same careful precision she'd applied to everything else in her marriage. Richard had packed his belongings and left the house Saturday night, but his presence lingered in every room. Mom moved through the spaces carefully, as if he might appear suddenly to criticize her housekeeping or correct her behavior. The habits of hypervigilance don't disappear overnight, and she still monitored her actions against standards he'd imposed. Pastor Williams visited Monday evening, bringing both personal support and church business that needed immediate attention. Richard's position would need to be filled, his responsibilities redistributed, his access to church facilities revoked. But the pastor also wanted to understand how the congregation had missed signs of abuse, how they could better protect vulnerable members in the future. "I keep thinking about the marriage classes they taught," Pastor Williams said, sitting in the living room where Richard had so recently dominated every conversation. He was teaching other couples about submission and leadership while abusing Janet. How do we reconcile that with our responsibility to promote healthy relationships? Mom sat quietly during this conversation, letting me handle most of the responses. She seemed overwhelmed by having opinions requested rather than dictated, uncertain how to navigate conversations where her input was genuinely valued rather than simply tolerated. The church's response split along predictable lines. Longtime members who had known Mom for years rallied around her immediately, offering practical support and expressing outrage at Richard's deception. Newer members who had been drawn to Richard's teachings struggled more with accepting that someone they'd viewed as spiritually mature could be capable of domestic violence. Several women privately approached Mom during the week, sharing their own experiences with controlling relationships or expressing gratitude that someone had finally spoken up about concerning patterns they'd noticed. These conversations revealed that Richard's behavior had made others uncomfortable, but the church's emphasis on supporting marriage and avoiding judgment had prevented anyone from intervening. "I thought about saying something several times," one longtime member admitted. "But he was so respected, and Janet seemed devoted to him. I told myself I was probably misreading the situation." These revelations highlighted how effectively Richard had used the church community's values against them, creating an environment where questioning his behavior felt like attacking the institution itself. His reputation had become armor that protected him from accountability, while isolating Mom from potential support. The legal implications developed slowly. I filed an incident report documenting what I'd witnessed, but Mom was reluctant to pursue charges. She worried about the public nature of a trial, the impact on the church community, the possibility that Richard might retaliate if cornered legally. Her concerns were realistic. Domestic violence cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victim is ambivalent about cooperation. "I just want him to stay away," Mom said when the prosecutor's office called to discuss potential charges. "I don't want to spend months reliving everything in courtroom testimony." I understood her reluctance, but I also knew that without legal consequences, Richard was free to find another vulnerable woman and repeat the pattern. His charm and manipulation skills hadn't diminished. He would simply apply them elsewhere while crafting a story about being persecuted by a vindictive stepson and unstable ex-wife. The protective order process moved forward regardless of criminal charges. Mom needed legal documentation that would keep Richard away from the house, the church, and her workplace. Even this step felt enormous to someone who had spent 2 years avoiding any action that might anger him. The paperwork required detailed documentation of abuse incidents, forcing Mom to articulate patterns she'd worked hard to minimize or rationalize. Writing down the facts in clinical legal language helped her see the relationship differently, making it harder to dismiss individual incidents as misunderstandings or accidents. "I didn't realize how often it happened until I had to list specific dates," she said after completing the forms. "It became normal, so I stopped counting." This recognition marked the beginning of Mom's ability to see Richard's treatment as abuse rather than marital conflict. The legal framework provided vocabulary and perspective that her religious training had obscured, helping her understand that submission didn't require accepting violence. Church attendance became complicated for both of us. Some members welcomed Mom with obvious relief, grateful that she was safe and hopeful about her future healing. Others seemed uncomfortable with her presence, uncertain how to interact with someone who represented the failure of their beliefs about marriage and forgiveness. The following Sunday, Pastor Williams addressed the congregation directly, speaking about domestic violence, the difference between submission and abuse, and the church's responsibility to protect vulnerable members. His sermon was thoughtful and necessary, but it also highlighted how unprepared the community was to handle these issues. "We failed Janet by not seeing what was happening," Pastor Williams said from the pulpit where Richard had so recently prayed about grateful wives. "We let our respect for marriage become blindness to abuse. We have to do better." Some members nodded agreement, others looked uncomfortable with admitting institutional failure. The congregation would need time to process how their values had been manipulated and what changes were necessary to prevent future harm. Mom and I began developing new rhythms for our relationship. Without Richard's controlling presence, she was slowly remembering how to make independent decisions, express personal preferences, and engage in conversations without constant monitoring of someone else's approval. But the healing process was neither linear nor simple. Some days, Mom seemed energized by her freedom, making plans and expressing opinions with growing confidence. Other days, she would become paralyzed by simple choices, overwhelmed by options she'd forgotten how to evaluate independently. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me what to do," she admitted one afternoon. "Making decisions feels dangerous, like I'm going to choose wrong and face consequences." The psychological effects of prolonged control run deeper than physical bruises. Richard had systematically undermined Mom's confidence in her own judgment, convincing her that independence was selfishness and that questioning his authority was sin. Rebuilding trust in her own instincts would take longer than healing from any physical injuries. Support groups became an essential part of Mom's recovery. Hearing other women describe similar experiences helped her understand that Richard's behavior wasn't unique, that the manipulation tactics he'd used were common among abusers, that her responses had been normal reactions to abnormal treatment. I thought I was the only person who could be fooled so completely, Mom said after her first group meeting. Learning that smart, capable women go through this too makes me feel less ashamed of how long I stayed. The shame was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Mom's healing. She blamed herself for not recognizing the warning signs, for defending Richard publicly, for allowing the abuse to continue as long as it had. Self-compassion felt like self-indulgence to someone who had been taught that her suffering was somehow deserved. As the weeks passed, I watched my mother slowly emerge from the careful shell she'd constructed for survival. Her laughter became more spontaneous, her opinions more decisive, her movements less calculated. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. She was remembering how to be herself. The legal protective order was granted without opposition. Richard's attorney advised him not to contest it, recognizing that public testimony would only further damage his already destroyed reputation. He was required to stay away from Mom, the church, and her workplace, essentially exiling him from the community where he'd built his identity. Reports filtered back about Richard's attempts to rebuild his life elsewhere. He'd moved to a neighboring state, found work with another church, begun presenting himself as the victim of false accusations by a vindictive family. His story emphasized forgiveness and redemption, carefully omitting the details that had led to his exposure. He's probably already targeting his next victim, I told Mom when we heard about his new position. Men like Richard don't change, they just find new situations to control. Mom nodded sadly, understanding that while she was safe, Richard remained dangerous to other women who might not have family members willing to intervene. The pattern would likely continue until he faced serious legal consequences or found someone strong enough to resist his manipulation from the beginning. The church began implementing new policies designed to prevent future abuse. Marriage counseling would include domestic violence screening, leadership positions would require background checks, and support systems would be established for members experiencing relationship problems. These changes came too late to help Mom, but they might protect others in the future. 6 months after the banquet confrontation, Mom was living independently for the first time in her adult life. She'd never been single after leaving her parents' home, moving directly from their protection to marriage with my father, then to marriage with Richard. Learning to make decisions without consulting anyone felt both liberating and terrifying. I keep reaching for the phone to ask someone else what they think, Mom said as she decided whether to repaint the kitchen. Then I remember that I'm allowed to choose colors I like without getting permission. These small acts of independence represented huge victories for someone who had forgotten she was entitled to preferences, opinions, and choices. Each decision reinforced her autonomy and rebuilt confidence that had been systematically destroyed. The relationship between Mom and the church community continued evolving. Some members remained uncomfortable with the disruption she represented, preferring to forget the embarrassing revelation about their former leader. Others embraced her story as evidence of the community's capacity for growth and healing. Mom found her place somewhere between these responses, participating in church activities while maintaining healthy boundaries around her privacy and healing process. She no longer felt obligated to be anyone's example of anything, not perfect wifehood, not gracious forgiveness, not inspiring survival. She could simply be herself, flawed and healing and human. As I watched her navigate this new freedom, I felt profound gratitude for the courage it had taken to break our family's pattern of protective silence. Speaking up at the banquet had cost Mom her marriage, her social position, and her carefully constructed sense of security. But it had also given her the chance to remember who she was before fear taught her to disappear. The woman who had raised me with quiet strength was finding her voice again, and that voice was worth every moment of discomfort the truth had caused. 1 year after the church banquet, Mom and I sat in her kitchen, the same room where I'd witnessed Richard's violence, but transformed now by her growing confidence and independence. She'd redecorated completely, choosing colors and furniture that reflected her preferences rather than someone else's demands. The space felt lighter, more welcoming, authentically hers for the first time. We were planning a small celebration for the anniversary of her protective order, a milestone that represented not just legal protection, but psychological freedom. The woman who once apologized for existing was now making plans, expressing preferences, and building a life that reflected her own values rather than someone else's expectations. "I've been thinking about dating again," Mom said, surprising me with both the announcement and the confidence with which she delivered it. "Not immediately, but someday. I want to know what it feels like to be chosen by someone who likes who I actually am." This revelation marked a profound shift in her healing. For months, Mom had focused on learning to be alone, developing independence, remembering how to make decisions without fear of retaliation. The idea that she might eventually trust someone enough to share her life again seemed impossibly optimistic during the darkest periods of her recovery. "I think that's wonderful," I said. "You deserve to be loved by someone who appreciates your strength, not someone who tries to diminish it." "I know the warning signs now," Mom continued. "I understand the difference between healthy support and dangerous control. I won't make the same mistakes again." Her confidence wasn't naive optimism, but hard-earned wisdom. The support groups, counseling sessions, and legal processes had provided education about abuse patterns, manipulation tactics, and red flags that her religious upbringing had never addressed. She was prepared to protect herself in ways she hadn't known were necessary before Richard. The church community had undergone its own transformation. Pastor Williams had completed specialized training in domestic violence recognition and response. New policies ensured that marriage counseling included safety assessments, that leadership positions required background checks, and that support systems existed for members experiencing relationship problems. "We can't undo our failure to protect Janet," Pastor Williams had said in a recent sermon. "But we can commit to doing better for everyone who comes after her." Several other women had privately disclosed their own experiences with controlling relationships, finding courage in Mom's story to seek help for situations they'd previously endured in silence. The congregation was learning that supporting marriage didn't require ignoring abuse, that promoting forgiveness didn't mean protecting abusers from consequences. Richard had disappeared from our awareness, which seemed appropriate given how completely he dominated it during his presence. Occasionally, rumors reached us about his attempts to establish himself elsewhere, always accompanied by stories about persecution and false accusations. But these reports felt increasingly irrelevant to our lives. He had become a cautionary tale rather than an active threat. The legal system had provided what protection it could. The protective order remained in effect, Richard's access to firearms had been restricted, and his record would show domestic violence convictions that might influence future custody or employment decisions. Justice in domestic violence cases is often incomplete, but Mom had received enough legal protection to rebuild her life safely. My relationship with Mom had evolved into something deeper and more honest than it had been before Richard. We'd moved beyond the careful politeness that had characterized our interactions during her marriage, developing the authentic intimacy that's only possible when both people feel free to speak truthfully. "I'm proud of you for speaking up that night," Mom said as we finished planning her anniversary celebration. "I was angry at the time, but I understand now that you saved my life. I was disappearing, and I didn't even realize it was happening." Her gratitude meant everything, but it also carried weight. My decision to expose Richard publicly had been necessary, but it had also been traumatic for Mom, forcing her to confront truths she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The fact that it had ultimately helped didn't erase the pain it had initially caused. "I'm proud of you for surviving," I replied, "and for doing the work to heal instead of just escaping." Recovery from abuse isn't just about leaving dangerous situations. It's about rebuilding the sense of self that systematic control destroys. Mom had done the difficult work of remembering who she was, learning to trust her own judgment, and developing the confidence to build a life that reflected her authentic preferences and values. The anniversary celebration was small but meaningful. A few close friends from church, some colleagues from Mom's return to work, and the counselor who had guided much of her healing process. We gathered in Mom's transformed kitchen, sharing stories about her progress, acknowledging how far she'd traveled from the woman who had once apologized for having opinions. "I want to read something," Mom said as the evening wound down. She pulled out a letter she'd written to herself on the day the protective order was granted, when freedom felt overwhelming and uncertain rather than celebratory. "Dear future Janet," she read aloud. "I don't know who you'll become now that you're allowed to be yourself again. I'm scared that I've forgotten how to make good decisions, that I'll choose wrong and end up hurt again. But I'm also excited to discover what I like, what I want, what makes me happy when I don't have to consider anyone else's approval first." She looked up from the letter, smiling at the room full of people who had supported her journey. "I wanted to remember how scared I was, so I could appreciate how far I've come." That woman who wrote this letter couldn't imagine feeling confident enough to host a party, to choose decorations, to invite people over without asking permission first. The contrast between the fearful woman who had written that letter and the confident host who was reading it marked the true measure of her healing. Mom had not only escaped abuse, she had reclaimed herself. As the guests departed and we cleaned up together, I reflected on the long journey from that night when I'd witnessed Richard's violence to this celebration of Mom's independence. The path had been neither straight nor easy, requiring courage from both of us and support from many others. "Do you ever regret speaking up that night?" Mom asked as we finished putting away dishes. "Never," I said immediately. "Do you regret that I did?" She considered the question seriously as she approached most things now. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I couldn't protect myself. But I don't regret being free." That freedom had cost her a marriage, a social position, and a sense of security that had been largely illusory anyway. But it had given her something more valuable: the chance to live authentically, to make choices based on her own values, to build relationships with people who loved her actual self rather than a carefully constructed performance. The kitchen where Richard had once slapped her while demanding she smile in church was now the heart of a home where Mom could express any emotion she felt, where her opinions were welcomed rather than criticized, where her preferences mattered because she was the one who had to live with them. 6 months later, Mom started dating a widowed teacher from a neighboring congregation, someone who had lost his wife to cancer and understood both grief and healing. Their relationship developed slowly, built on genuine compatibility rather than desperate need, grounded in mutual respect rather than traditional role expectations. "He asks what I think about things," Mom told me after their third date. "Not to test whether I'm thinking correctly, but because he actually wants to know my opinion." It's amazing how different that feels. Watching Mom rediscover romance from a position of strength rather than vulnerability brought our story full circle. The woman who had once believed that silence was a virtue had learned to use her voice. The woman who had once disappeared into someone else's shadow had learned to stand in her own light. Richard had taught her that love required sacrificing herself. Now she was learning that real love asked her to be fully herself. The difference wasn't subtle. It was revolutionary, transformative, life-giving in ways that made every difficult moment of the journey worthwhile. 2 years after I'd stood up in that church banquet hall and said, "I saw everything," my mother was building a life that reflected everything I'd hoped she might rediscover about herself. She was no longer silent, no longer small, no longer afraid to take up space in her own existence. The lesson she'd taught me about silence, being a virtue, had been incomplete. Sometimes silence protects the innocent, but sometimes it protects the guilty. Sometimes speaking up causes pain, but sometimes staying quiet causes more. The wisdom is knowing the difference and having the courage to act on that knowledge when the stakes matter most. My mother had taught me that silence was a virtue, but I had taught her that some truths are worth the cost of speaking them aloud. In the end, that exchange saved both of us from living with regrets about choosing comfort over courage when someone we loved needed protection. The woman who had raised me with quiet strength had found her voice again, and the sound of it was beautiful. That night at the church banquet, the silence finally broke and nothing was the same after. My mom got her freedom, and I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay quiet. Have you ever had to step in when someone you love was being mistreated? Do you think I was right to call him out publicly, or should I have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if this story hit home for you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. Silence protects abusers, but truth protects the people we love.